What's up, guys? Welcome to quiz number 12. If you're new here, this is the series where differently rated players analyze the same three positions, figure out what they think the best move was and why, and then we kind of talk about those results in this video. As always, pause the video as we go through if you'd like to just follow along that way, or you can click on the link in the description below. Let's get started. Right, here's position number 1. If you'd like to pause the video and figure out what you would play for white, go ahead and do that now. I'll give you a couple seconds to do that. And when you're ready to see the solution, here we go. From 0 to 1000, the top move was knight to f6, and the second move was queen to g4, and the third move was a3. 1000 to 1600, again we had knight f6, again queen g4, and then the third move was a bishop to h6. And then above 1600, the top move was queen to g4, followed by knight f6, and then queen to h5. All right, so when we look at this position, one of the key features is the fact that black's king's over here, and the majority of black's pieces are on the other side of the board, and there's kind of some pieces sort of in the way, making it a little bit difficult for those pieces to get back over and help out. And white's pieces are very nicely positioned for an attack on black's king. So that was kind of the main idea behind this position, that like, okay, white should somehow try to attack black's king. And most people seemed to understand that, with the exception of those who said a3. a3 is probably not really going to help you much with an attack on the king. Now, that being said, knight f6, queen g4, queen h5, bishop h6, all different ways to try to attack the king. So let's talk about which one was the best and why. So let's start with knight f6 check, because whenever you're calculating how to attack someone's king, that's usually a good place to start. You want to start with the checks. So knight f6 check, the obvious move that you have to make sure works for you is if they just take your knight. And then really, if you take here, or if you play queen g4 check first, it's probably going to lead to pretty similar positions. So we'll just start with the check. The king's going to go over, and then you have kind of two options, but they both sort of do the same thing, threaten this checkmate on g7. So we'll say, let's just take with the pawn. And then black can slide the rook over, right? And if you analyze this, you maybe saw that, okay, after this point, now we have to move our queen. Let's say we move it over here. Do we have a good way to follow up? The answer is not really. And we actually have to be a little bit careful. Now there's a rook on our king. If the bishop, the queen, there's really not a good way for us to follow up, basically. And so we lost a knight, and we don't have a good follow-up. And so that's why knight f6 wasn't the best move. Even though it does look scary for black, we need more than just scary. We need a concrete way to follow up, and there really isn't anything here. So let's go back. Now I want to talk about the move bishop h6 next, because this was a very nice try. So if you said bishop h6, props to you for suggesting this move, and here's why. The obvious pawn takes bishop actually loses immediately for black, and there's mate in 5. You bring the knight in, king has to move somewhere, and then you just play the simple queen c2, and you're just going for the checkmate here. And black actually can't do anything about it. It's just going to get mated in a couple moves. So that was a very good idea. Now, it turns out that the computer doesn't like it, and it's because of the move king to h8, not even taking the bishop, just setting up to take it next move, and now you have the rook that can kind of help out, and it's just not the same position. And you could follow up and continue the attack, but here it's just not quite the same. Knight f6, and black actually has rook h8, and the king is going to be able to escape this way if you try to like come in with check, and you don't really have anything. So but really nice try, and a lot of people in a normal game would probably have a hard time finding that move. But that was the subtle reason why bishop h6 didn't work. And if you thought that queen h5 was a good way to attack, it turns out that black can just kind of ignore it, capture your rook. And a lot of people, I'm assuming, were thinking of following up with knight f6. But then black can just take it, and even though it looks scary, once the king slides over, there's not really a good follow-up for white. You can go for the checkmate threat, but rook g8 just prevents it, and you don't really have anything. And then the other move that maybe some people were thinking you could try would be, knight here. But then black can just play something like h6. And again, you have the same problem of like, okay, well, what do you do next? And it turns out that it just didn't quite work. So good ideas, but the best move was queen to g4. Now, the big threat of queen g4 is that you want to play bishop to h6 and go for checkmate that way. And it's a little bit better because, for example, let's just say black ignores you, takes your rook. You're going to go bishop h6. Threatening checkmate, okay, and now king h8 doesn't work, obviously you just take it, so black has to play g6. You can bring the knight in, king can go over, and you can just simply take this is the best move. And black can actually survive and not get mated right away but it's very, very bad for black. They're going to have to be super careful. Computer really likes white's position. There's all sorts of potential checkmate threats if black doesn't play extremely accurately. And even if they do, you're still way ahead. So that was kind of the idea. Now let's go back instead of bishop takes f1. And it turns out that like one of the moves that we saw before, king h8, where black was kind of preparing to bring the rook over if needed, is actually an okay move here again, because it kind of deals with that threat now. And it turns out the best thing for white to do is just slide the rook over, get out of the attack, and just put it on an open file. And basically you're just kind of setting up to continue the attack later. There's nothing immediate, so there's no immediate checkmate. There's no tactic that's going to win you a piece or anything. You're just kind of repositioning your pieces to good squares. Rook on open file, queen is on that side of the board, so it's ready to attack. And now, depending on what black does, you can either continue your attack or do other things if black defends correctly. So there was no immediate threat. I just wanted to see if people kind of noticed that none of those threats actually worked. The best thing for you to do is just kind of play it calm, bring the queen over, bring the rook over, and you just kind of build your advantage slowly like that. And so if we check Stockfish, queen g4, only move that really gives white the advantage, and then a3 and rook e1 were next, but that's going to be better for black. So this was the only move to keep the advantage. Okay, here's position number 2. If you'd like to pause the video, figure out what you would play for white, go ahead and do that. I'll give you a few seconds to do that. And if you're ready, here we go. 0 to 1,000, we had the top move of king g2. Second move was rook takes b7, and third move was pawn to d6. 1,000 to 1,600, top move was king to g2, and then the second and third move, so second move was rook f7, and third move was rook takes b7. And then 1,600 and above was the exact same thing, king to g2, rook f7, and rook takes b7. All right, first thing I want to point out about this position, even though maybe it didn't look super complicated to some people, this was actually a very, very tricky position. And it just goes to show that even though you're in an endgame, does not mean that you don't have to calculate, does not mean that there aren't all sorts of tricks that are available. So let's just start first with the obvious. What happens if we just take the bishop, right? Well, then black's going to play this fork, which I think most people saw, but there's actually a lot more going on here than just a simple knight fork. For example, we actually have to play king h1. If we do anything else, we're in big trouble. So for example, if we go to g2, well, now black just takes the bishop, and there's this attack on f2, which is very, very annoying. If we try to defend it with like this rook, well, then black can go here, we can go here, and black forces our rook off of this file. And once we move it somewhere, well, now we're just getting checkmated by these rooks. So that's, kind of one thing to watch out for. There's also, a bishop over here, which black's about to capture. So we have to kind of watch out for that. And really cool thing for black is if we go to the corner, they actually have, instead of even taking that, which is not the best move, they can capture here with the rook. And this is a checkmate threat. So we have to take, and again, that's checkmate. If we let the rook go there, it's just game over. We can't move our king. And so I don't know if you see any way to get out of this. There's actually one little trick available. I'll give you a couple seconds. What can we play for white to save the game from this position? This is the threat. Well, if you said rook to h7 check, you are correct. That's really the only move for us. And the point is that we're just giving it up for free because we need the king to be in that diagonal. Then we can play bishop b1 check. And after the king moves, we play rook a2. And now we've defended the checkmate with our rook. And after rook f1, working these pieces, we can go to g2, takes. And we get this endgame where we're up a pawn, but it's actually pretty equal. It's probably going to end up being a draw if black knows what they're doing and puts up a good fight. Most likely will be a draw. So really crazy stuff there. But just goes to show like how much is actually going on in this position. Okay, so because of that, rook takes b7 isn't actually very good. Rook f7, trying to kind of defend here. There's actually a little tactic black has. Rook takes a2. And if we take it, well, then there's this really interesting rook to e1 check, which forces our king to either go to g2 or h2. Now, we don't want to go to g2 or we're going to just lose the game because the bishop's going to take here. We have this nasty triple fork, all sorts of bad news for us. So we have to go to h2, but then it allows black to just go here, check. And again, we don't want to go into, these white squares and allow that. So we have to go here, and black actually just gets a perpetual check back and forth with the knight. And so it's just a draw. So pretty interesting there. That's the idea with rook f7, that there's this little sacrifice, and that was very hard to see. So if you didn't see that, don't feel bad. I didn't catch a lot of this stuff when I first looked at this position either. And so because of all those tactics that were available, the best move for white and the way that white keeps the advantage is just by simply sliding the king up. Big thing that move does is, number one, it takes away the fork there from the knight. Number two, if black tries to capture here and set up this little tricky fork, well, you just ignore that, you take the bishop, and you've got your rook defended here, and so you're actually just in a better position, because at the end of all this stuff, you do have this passed pawn, which is going to be very strong. So that little trick doesn't work, and the best thing that black can do, according to the engine, is just move the bishop back to c8, and then you can just push your pawn, and you're just in a good position, basically, because king g2 kind of stopped all of those little tactics and tricks. So that was the idea, but very, very tricky to find that move in this position. And we check Stockfish, like we already talked about, king g2 was the only move that really kept the advantage for white. Everything else, I already showed you all the tricks that black had, and it was pretty much equal in those cases. All right, here's position number 3. It's white to play. Go ahead and pause the video if you'd like and figure out what move you would play. I'll give you a couple seconds to do that. And when you're ready to see the solution, here we go. All right, so 0 to 1,000, the top move was king to g3, then king f2 and king f1. 1,000 to 1,600, again, king g3, and then king f1 and king f2. And above 1,600, the top move was king f1, then king g3, and then king f2. All right, so this position, I actually tricked most of you. So everyone who said king g3, you were wrong, and that was the idea that I was trying to see. So most people who aren't familiar with king and pawn endgames, and there's actually something called triangulation, where you have to basically maneuver your king around to kind of lose a tempo. And so, the problem with just moving your king up, black just simply slides the king over, and yes, you can push your pawn forward, but it doesn't help you. Black plays king e4, and guess what? Now you have to move somewhere. You can't go here, you can't go here, and you're losing your pawn, right? And so you're just going to end up getting a draw. Nobody's going to make progress here and be able to win the game. So that doesn't help you. And that was kind of the problem with king g3. It doesn't accomplish anything. So if we go back, another move, king f2, some people said, well, again, that doesn't really accomplish anything. Black just moves the king up. They have opposition, very good term to know in king endings. And we have to okay, we can go back here, black can go here. We have the exact same position. Again, we didn't accomplish anything. So the way triangulation works in these king and pawn endings is that instead of just going immediately to a square, you kind of do this little dance where you go boom, boom. And so you take 2 moves to get to the same square instead of taking 1 move. And what that does is it resets the opposition. So for example, if I go back here and black's king comes up, well, now I'm going to go to f2 just like I did before, except now I made the move, which means I have the opposition on black's king. The difference is that now instead of me having to move away, black has to move away. So let's say they just go back here. Well, now we can bring our king around to the side here. And we've changed the position. Now it's not the same position. If black goes here, guess what? Now we play f4 check. The king goes over, and guess what? We have the opposition, very different than before. Again, black's king has to go back, and we just keep kind of running up the board, and now we're going to win. Let me go back, and one other thing that you might be wondering is, okay, well, what if, the king doesn't come up? They just stay back there. And you're probably thinking, if we go to f2, well, then they're going to get opposition. You're absolutely right. So what do? Now we go to f1. And again, they don't want to come up because it allows us opposition. So they kind of have to just go back and forth. And now we can come up here. And what we're doing is whenever black plays there, we're getting in the opposition, right? So that's one part of it. And then the other thing is now we've figured out a way to maneuver our king around to the side. So if black doesn't come up, well, then we just come up here, right? And this is a much better position for our king than the last example. And so now again, we can push f4. And black is going to get this pawn on h4, but we can just come up, allow the capture, and we have a couple ways to actually win from here, but one that I like is by pushing the pawn. Black can try to stop us, but we're not going to let him. We're escorting the pawn up. So the only thing black can really do is try to push their pawn. It's kind of a race, but you can see we're going to win, right? We're going to win the race. And now we have a nice little way to finish off the game. I'll let you see if you can spot it. What move do we play for white? Go ahead and pause if you need to. Well, if you said queen to g8 check, you are correct. Actually, queen to g8 or queen to g7, any of these checks, because our king covers these squares, we're forcing black's king to go on this file, which as you can see is lined up with their queen, which is not what they want to do. And it doesn't really matter where they go. We're going to skewer the king, and as soon as it moves, we take the queen. So nice little end game, a lot trickier than I think people realized. And so that was kind of what I was going for. King and pawn endings can be very tricky, and it's important to know about, number one, opposition. You have to understand that it's usually beneficial to get opposition. So, you know, going back here, if the king comes up, boom, we get the opposition. That's very important. And then also that idea of, instead of just moving your king over immediately, you can also do a little dance, or even, you know, something like this, just to kind of waste a move so that you're going to be the one who gets opposition. That's the whole point of doing that little triangulation thing. So keep those ideas in mind in your king and pawn endings. So anyway, I hope you guys found that interesting and learned something there. Well, thanks for participating in this week's quiz. If you'd like to get in on next week's quiz early, there's a link in the description below. You can click on that. But as always, stay sharp, play smart, and take care.